The Road to Makkah. By Muhammad Asad. 7 Midway, Section 1-3. 1. We have left Hale and are riding toward Medina. Now 3 riders for one of Ibn Musad's men, Mansur al-Asaf, is accompanying us part of the way on an errand of the Amir. Mansur is so handsome that if he were to appear on the streets of a western city all the women would turn to look after him. He is very tall, with a strong, virile face and amazingly even features. His skin is whitish-brown, an infallible mark of good birth among Arabs, and a pair of black eyes survey the world keenly from beneath well-shaped brows. There is nothing in him of Zayd's delicacy or of Zayd's quiet detachment. The lines of his face speak of violent, if controlled, passions and lend to his appearance an aura of somberness quite unlike the serene gravity of my Shamir friend. But Mansur, like Zayd, has seen a lot of the world and makes a pleasant companion. In the grey and yellow, pebbly soil that has now replaced the sands of the Nafud we can descry the little animal life that fills it. Tiny grey lizards zigzag between our camels' feet at an incredible speed. Take refuge under a thorny shrub and watch our passing with blazing eyes, little grey field mice with bushy tails, resembling squirrels, and their cousins, the marmots, whose flesh is highly esteemed by the Bedouins of Najd and is, indeed, one of the tenderest delicacies I have ever tasted. There is also the foot-long edible lizard called dab which thrives on the roots of plants and tastes like a cross between chicken and fish. Black four-legged beetles the size of a small hen's egg can be observed as they roll with touching patience a ball of dry camel dung, pushing it backward with strong hind legs while the body leans on the forelegs. They roll the precious find painfully toward their homes, fall on their backs if a pebble happens to obstruct their path, turn over with difficulty on their legs again, roll their possession a few inches farther, fall again, get up again and work, tirelessly. Sometimes a grey hare jumps away in long leaps from beneath grey bushes. Once we see gazelles, but too distant to shoot, they disappear in the blue-grey shadows between 2 hills. Tell me, O Muhammad, asks Mansur, how did it happen that thou hast come to live among the Arabs? And how didst thou come to embrace Islam? I will tell thee how it happened, interposes Zayd. First, he fell in love with the Arabs, and then with their faith. Isn't it true, O my uncle? What Zayd says is true, O Mansur. Many years ago, when I first came to Arab lands, I was attracted by the way you people lived. And when I began to ask myself what you thought and what you believed in, I came to know about Islam. And didst thou, O Muhammad, find all at once that Islam was the true word of God? Well, no, this did not come about so quickly. For one thing, I did not then believe that God had ever spoken directly to man, or that the books which men claimed to be his word were anything but the works of wise men. Mansur stares at me with utter incredulity. How could that be, O Muhammad? Didst thou not even believe in the scriptures which Moses brought, or the gospel of Jesus? But I have always thought that the peoples of the West believe at least in them. Some do, O Mansur, and others do not. I was one of those others. And I explained to him that many people in the West have long ceased to regard the scriptures, their own as well as those of others, as true revelations of God but see in them rather the history of man's religious aspirations as they have evolved over the ages. But this view of mine was shaken as soon as I came to know something of Islam, I add. I came to know about it when I found that the Muslims lived in a way quite different from what the Europeans thought should be man's way, and every time I learned something more about the teachings of Islam, I seemed to discover something that I had always known without knowing it. And so I go on, telling Mansur of my first journey to the Near East, of how in the desert of Sinai I had my first impression of the Arabs, of what I saw and felt in Palestine, Egypt, Transjordan and Syria. Of how in Damascus I had my first premonition that a new, hitherto unsuspected way to truth was slowly unfolding before me. And how, after visiting Turkey, I returned to Europe and found it difficult to live again in the Western world. 4. On the one hand, I was eager to gain a deeper understanding of the strange uneasiness which my first acquaintance with the Arabs and their culture had produced in me, hoping that it would help me better understand what I myself expected of life, and, on the other hand, I had reached the point where it was becoming clear to me that never again would I be able to identify myself with the aims of Western society. In the spring of 1924 the Frankfurter Zeitung sent me out on my second journey to the Middle East. The book describing my previous travels had at last been completed. It was published a few months after my departure under the title Unromantisches Morgenland, by which I meant to convey that it was not a book about the romantic, exotic outward picture of the Muslim East but rather an endeavor to penetrate to its day-by-day realities. Although its anti-Zionist attitude and unusual predilection for the Arabs caused something of a flutter in the German press, I am afraid it did not sell very well. Once again, I crossed the Mediterranean and saw the coast of Egypt before me. The railway journey from Port Said to Cairo was like turning the leaves of a familiar book. Between the Suez Canal and Lake Manzila the Egyptian afternoon unfolded itself. Wild ducks swam in the water and tamarisks shook their finely scalloped branches. Villages grew up out of the plain, which was at first sandy and sparsely covered with vegetation. Dark water buffaloes, often coupled with camels, were drawing plows with lazy limbs through the spring soil. As we turned westward from the Suez Canal, Egyptian green enveloped us. When I saw once again the slim, tall women who were swaying in indescribable rhythm, striding over the fields and carrying pitchers free on their heads with arms outstretched, I thought to myself, nothing in the whole world, neither the most perfect automobile nor the proudest bridge nor the most thoughtful book, can replace this grace which has been lost in the West, and is already threatened in the East, this grace which is nothing but an expression of the magic consonance between a human being's self and the world that surrounds him. This time I traveled first class. In the compartment there were only 2 passengers besides me, a Greek businessman from Alexandria who, with the ease so characteristic of all Levantines, soon involved me in an animated conversation and supplied witty observations on all we saw, and an Egyptian umda, a village headman, who, judging from his costly silk kaftan and the thick gold watch chain that protruded from his sash, was obviously rich but seemed content to remain entirely uneducated. In fact, almost as soon as he joined our conversation, he readily admitted that he could neither read nor write. Nevertheless, he also displayed a sharp common sense and frequently crossed swords with the Greek. We were talking, I remember, about some of the social principles in Islam which at that time strongly occupied my thoughts. My Greek fellow traveler did not entirely agree with my admiration of the social equity in the law of Islam. It is not as equitable as you seem to think, my dear friend, and, changing from the French, into which we had lapsed, into Arabic again for the benefit of our Egyptian companion, he now turned to him, you people say that your religion is so equitable. Couldst thou perhaps then tell us, why it is that Islam allows Muslim men to marry Christian or Jewish girls but does not allow your daughters and sisters to marry a Christian or Jew? Dost thou call this justice, huh? I do, indeed, replied the portly umda without a moment's hesitation, and I shall tell thee why our religious law has been thus laid down. We Muslims do not believe that Jesus, may peace and God's blessing be upon him, was God's son. But we do consider him, as we consider Moses and Abraham and all the other prophets of the Bible, a true prophet of God. All of them having been sent to mankind in the same way as the last prophet. Muhammad, may God bless him and give him peace, was sent. And so, if a Jewish or Christian girl marries a Muslim, she may rest assured that none of the persons who are holy to her will ever be spoken of irreverently among her new family, while, on the other hand, should a Muslim girl marry non-Muslim, it is certain that he whom she regards as God's messenger will be abused. And perhaps even by her own children, for do not children usually follow their father's faith? Dost thou think it would be fair to expose her to such pain and humiliation? The Greek had no answer to this except an embarrassed shrug of his shoulders, but to me it seemed that the simple, illiterate Umda had, with that common sense so peculiar to his race, touched the kernel of a very important problem. And once again, as with that old Haji in Jerusalem, I felt that a new door to Islam was being opened to me. In accordance with my changed financial circumstances, I was now able to live in Cairo in a style which would have been unthinkable a few months earlier. I no longer needed to count pennies. The days when, during my first stay in the city, I had to subsist on bread, olives, and milk, were forgotten. But in one respect I kept faith with the traditions of my past. Instead of putting up in one of the fashionable quarters of Cairo, I rented rooms in the house of my old friend, the fat woman from Trieste, who received me with open arms and a motherly kiss on both cheeks. On the third day after my arrival, at sunset, I heard the muffled sound of cannon from the citadel. At the same moment a circle of lights sprang up on the highest galleries of the two minarets that flanked the citadel mosque, and all the minarets of all the mosques in the city, took up that illumination and repeated it, on every minaret a similar circle of lights. Through Old Cairo there went a strange movement, quicker and at the same time more festive became the step of the people, louder the polyphonous noise in the streets, you could sense and almost hear a new tension quiver at all comers. And all this happened because the new crescent moon announced a new month, for the Islamic calendar goes by lunar months and years, and that month was Ramadan, the most solemn month of the Islamic year. It commemorates the time, more than 1300 years ago, when, according to tradition, Muhammad received the first revelation of the Quran. Strict fasting is expected of every Muslim during this month. Men and women, save those who are ill, are forbidden to take food or drink, and even to smoke, from the moment when the first streak of light on the eastern horizon announces the coming dawn, until sunset, for 30 days. During these 30 days the people of Cairo went around with glowing eyes, as if elevated to holy regions. In the 30 nights you heard cannon fire, singing and cries of joy, while all the mosques glowed with light until daybreak. Twofold, I learned, is the purpose of this month of fasting. One has to abstain from food and drink in order to feel in one's own body what the poor and hungry feel, thus, social responsibility is being hammered into human consciousness as a religious postulate. The other purpose of fasting during Ramadan is self-discipline, an aspect of individual morality strongly accentuated in all Islamic teachings. As, for instance, in the total prohibition of all intoxicants, which Islam regards as too easy an avenue of escape from consciousness and responsibility. In these two elements, brotherhood of man and individual self-discipline, I began to discern the outlines of Islam's ethical outlook. In my endeavor to gain a fuller picture of what Islam really meant and stood for, I derived great benefit from the explanations which some of my Kareen Muslims friends were able to provide me. Outstanding among them was Sheikh Mustafa al-Maraki, one of the most prominent Islamic scholars of the time and certainly the most brilliant among the ulama of Al-Azhar University. He was destined to become its rector some years later. He must have been in his middle 40s at that time, but his stocky, muscular body had the alertness and vivacity of a 20-year-old. In spite of his erudition and gravity, his sense of humor never left him. A pupil of the great Egyptian reformer Muhammad Abduh, and having associated in his youth with that inspiring firebrand, Jamal ad-Din al-Afghani, Sheikh al-Maraghi was himself a keen, critical thinker. He never failed to impress upon me that the Muslims of recent times had fallen very short indeed of the ideals of their faith, and that nothing could be more erroneous than to measure the potentialities of Muhammad's message by the yardstick of present-day Muslim life and thought. Just as, he said, it would be erroneous to see in the Christians' unloving behavior toward one another a refutation of Christ's message of love. With this warning, Sheikh al-Maraghi introduced me to Al-Azhar. Out of the crowded bustle of Muski Street, Cairo's oldest shopping center, we reached a small, out-of-the-way square. One of its sides occupied by the broad, straight front of the Azhar Mosque. Through a double gate and a shadowy forecourt, we entered the courtyard of the mosque proper, a large quadrangle surrounded by ancient arcades. Students dressed in long, dark jubbas and white turbans were sitting on straw mats and reading with low voices from their books and manuscripts. The lectures were given in the huge, covered mosque hall beyond. Several teachers sat, also on straw mats, under the pillars which crossed the hall in long rows, and in a semicircle before each teacher crouched a group of students. The lecturer never raised his voice, so that it obviously required great attention and concentration not to miss any of his words. One should have thought that such absorption would be conducive to real scholarship, but Sheikh al-Maraghi soon shattered my illusions. "Dost thou see those scholars over there?" he asked me. "They are like those sacred cows in India which, I am told, eat up all the printed paper they can find in the streets. Yes, they gobble up all the printed pages from books that have been written centuries ago, but they do not digest them. They no longer think for themselves, they read and repeat, and the students who listen to them learn only to read and repeat, generation after generation." "But, Sheikh Mustafa," I interposed, "Al-Azhar is, after all, the central seat of Islamic learning, and the oldest university in the world. One encounters its name on nearly every page of Muslim cultural history. What about all the great thinkers, the theologians, historians, philosophers, mathematicians it has produced over the last 10 centuries? It stopped producing them several centuries ago," he replied ruefully. "Well, perhaps not quite. Here and there an independent thinker has somehow managed to emerge from Al-Azhar even in recent times. But on the whole, Al-Azhar has lapsed into the sterility from which the whole Muslim world is suffering, and its old impetus is all but extinguished. Those ancient Islamic thinkers whom thou hast mentioned would never have dreamed that after so many centuries their thoughts, instead of being continued and developed, would only be repeated over and over again, as if they were ultimate and infallible truths. If there is to be any change for the better, thinking must be encouraged instead of the present thought imitation." Sheikh al-Maraghi's trenchant characterization of Al-Azhar helped me to realize one of the deepest causes of the cultural decay that stared one in the face everywhere in the Muslim world. Was not the scholastic petrifaction of this ancient university mirrored, in varying degrees, counterpart of this intellectual stagnation to be found in the passive, almost indolent, acceptance by so many Muslims of the unnecessary poverty in which they lived, of their mute toleration of the many social wrongs to which they were subjected? And was it any wonder then, I asked myself, that, fortified by such tangible evidence of Muslim decay, so many erroneous views about Islam itself were prevalent throughout the West? These popular Western views could be summarized thus: the downfall of the Muslims is mainly due to Islam, which, far from being a religious ideology comparable to Christianity or Judaism, is a rather unholy mixture of desert fanaticism, gross sensuality, superstition and dumb fatalism that prevents its adherents from participating in mankind's advance toward higher social forms. Instead of liberating the human spirit from the shackles of obscurantism, Islam rather tightens them, and, consequently, the sooner the Muslim peoples are freed from their subservience to Islamic beliefs and social practices and induced to adopt the Western way of life, the better for them and for the rest of the world. My own observations had by now convinced me that the mind of the average Westerner held an utterly distorted image of Islam. What I saw in the pages of the Quran was not a crudely materialistic worldview but, on the contrary, an intense God consciousness that expressed itself in a rational acceptance of all God-created nature, a harmonious side-by-side of intellect and sensual urge, spiritual need and social demand. It was obvious to me that the decline of the Muslims was not due to any shortcomings in Islam but rather to their own failure to live up to it. For, indeed, it was Islam that had carried the early Muslims to tremendous cultural heights by directing all their energies toward conscious thought as the only means to understanding the nature of God's creation and, thus, of His will. No demand had been made of them to believe in dogmas difficult or even impossible of intellectual comprehension. In fact, no dogma whatsoever was to be found in the Prophet's message, and, thus, the thirst after knowledge which distinguished early Muslim history had not been forced, as elsewhere in the world, to assert itself in a painful struggle against the traditional faith. On the contrary, it had stemmed exclusively from that faith. The Arabian prophet had declared that striving after knowledge is a most sacred duty for every Muslim man and woman, and his followers were led to understand that only by acquiring knowledge could they fully worship the Lord. When they pondered the prophet's saying, God creates no disease without creating a cure for it as well, they realized that by searching for unknown cures they would contribute to a fulfillment of God's will on earth, and so medical research became invested with the holiness of a religious duty. They read the Quran verse, "We create every living thing out of water," and in their endeavor to penetrate to the meaning of these words, they began to study living organisms and the laws of their development, and thus they established the science of biology. The Quran pointed to the harmony of the stars and their movements as witnesses of their Creator's glory, and thereupon the sciences of astronomy and mathematics were taken up by the Muslims with a fervor which in other religions was reserved for prayer alone. The Copernican system, which established the Earth's rotation around its axis and the revolution of the planets around the Sun, was evolved in Europe at the beginning of the 16th century, only to be met by the fury of the ecclesiastics, who read in it a contradiction of the literal teachings of the Bible. But the foundations of this system had actually been laid 600 years earlier. In Muslim countries, for already in the 9th and 10th centuries Muslim astronomers had reached the conclusion that the Earth was globular and that it rotated around its axis, and had made accurate calculations of latitudes and longitudes, and many of them maintained, without ever being accused of heresy, that the Earth rotated around the Sun. And in the same way they took to chemistry and physics and physiology, and to all the other sciences in which the Muslim genius was to find its most lasting monument. In building that monument they did no more than follow the admonition of their prophet that if anybody proceeds on his way in search of knowledge, God will make easy for him the way to paradise, that the scientist walks in the path of God, that the superiority of the learned over the mere pious is like the superiority of the moon when it is full over all other stars, and that the ink of the scholars is more precious than the blood of martyrs. Throughout the whole creative period of Muslim history, that is to say, during the first 5 centuries after the Prophet's time, science and learning had no greater champion than Muslim civilization and no home more secure than the lands in which Islam was supreme. Social life was similarly affected by the teachings of the Quran. At a time when in Christian Europe an epidemic was regarded as a scourge of God to which man had but to submit meekly, at that time, and long before it, the Muslims followed the injunction of their prophet which directed them to combat epidemics by segregating the infected towns and areas. And at a time when even the kings and nobles of Christendom regarded bathing as an almost indecent luxury. Even the poorest of Muslim houses had at least one bathroom, while elaborate public baths were common in every Muslim city. In the 9th century, for instance, Córdoba had 300 of them, and all this in response to the Prophet's teaching that cleanliness is part of faith. A Muslim did not come into conflict with the claims of spiritual life if he took pleasure in the beautiful things of material life, for, according to the Prophet, God loves to see on his servants an evidence of his bounty. In short, Islam gave a tremendous incentive to cultural achievements which constitute one of the proudest pages in the history of mankind, and it gave this incentive by saying yes to the intellect and no to obscurantism, yes to action and no to quietism, yes to life and no to asceticism. Little wonder, then, that as soon as it emerged beyond the confines of Arabia, Islam won new adherents by leaps and bounds. Born and nurtured in the world contempt of Pauline and Augustinian Christianity, the populations of Syria and North Africa, and a little later of Visigothic Spain, saw themselves suddenly confronted with a teaching which denied the dogma of original sin and stressed the inborn dignity of earthly life, and so they rallied in ever-increasing numbers to the new creed that gave them to understand that man was God's vicar on earth. This, and not a legendary conversion at the point of the sword, was the explanation of Islam's amazing triumph in the glorious morning of its history. It was not the Muslims that had made Islam great, it was Islam that had made the Muslims great. But as soon as their faith became habit and ceased to be a program of life, to be consciously pursued, the creative impulse that underlay their civilization waned and gradually gave way to indolence, sterility and cultural decay. The new insight I had gained, and the progress I was making in the Arabic language, I had arranged for a student of Al-Azhar to give me daily lessons, made me feel that now at last I possessed something like a key to the Muslim mind. No longer was I so certain that a European could never consciously grasp the total picture, as I had written in my book only a few months earlier, for now, this Muslim world no longer seemed so entirely alien to Western associations. It occurred to me that if one was able to achieve a certain degree of detachment from his own past habits of thought and allow for the possibility that they might not be the only valid ones, the once so strange Muslim world might indeed become graspable. But although I found much in Islam that appealed to my intellect as well as to my instincts, I did not consider it desirable for an intelligent man to conform all his thinking and his entire view of life to a system not devised by himself. "Tell me, Sheikh Mustafa," I asked my erudite friend Al-Maraghi on one occasion, "why should it be necessary to confine oneself to one particular teaching and one particular set of injunctions? Mightn't it be better to leave all ethical inspiration to one's inner voice? What thou art really asking, my young brother, is why should there be any institutional religion? The answer is simple. Only very few people, only prophets, are really able to understand the inner voice that speaks in them. Most of us are trammeled by our personal interests and desires, and if everyone were to follow only what his own heart dictates, we would have complete moral chaos and could never agree on any mode of behavior. Thou couldst ask, of course, whether there are no exceptions to the general rule, enlightened people who feel they have no need to be guided in what they consider to be right or wrong, but then, I ask thee, would not many, very many people claim that exceptional right for themselves? And what would be the result? I had been in Cairo for nearly 6 weeks when I suffered a recurrence of malaria, which had first attacked me in Palestine the previous year. It began with a headache and dizziness and pains in all my limbs, and by the end of the day, I was flat on my back, unable to lift my hand. Signora Vitelli, my landlady, bustling around me almost as if she were enjoying my helplessness, but her concern was genuine. She gave me hot milk to drink and placed cold compresses over my head, but when I suggested that perhaps a doctor should be called in, she bristled indignantly. A doctor? Pooh! What do those butchers know about malaria? I know more about it than any of them. My sainted second husband died of it in Albania. We had been living in Durazzo for some years and, poor soul, was often racked with pains worse than yours, but he always had confidence in me. I was too weak to argue and let her fill me up with a potent brew of hot Greek wine and quinine, not any of your sugar-coated pills but the real, powdered stuff which shook me with its bitterness almost more than the fever did. But somehow, strange to say, I had full confidence in Mama Vitelli in spite of her ominous reference to her sainted second husband. That night, while my body was burning with fever, I suddenly heard a tender, intensive music from the street, the sound of a barrel organ. It was not one of those ordinary barrel organs with wheezy bellows and cracked pipes, but rather something that reminded you of the brittle, old clavichords which, because they were too delicate and too limited in nuances, had long ago been discarded in Europe. I had seen such barrel organs earlier in Cairo. A man carried the box on his back, a boy followed him, turning the handle, and the tones fell singly, short and neat, like arrows hitting their mark, like the tinkling of glass, with spaces in between. And as they were so unmixed and so isolated from one another, these tones did not allow the listener to grasp the whole melody, but dragged him instead, in jerks, through tender, tense moments. They were like a secret which you were trying to unravel, but could not, and they tormented you with their eternal repetition in your head, over and over through the night, like a whirling circle from which there was no escape, like the dance of the whirling dervishes you had seen at Scutari. Was it months, was it years ago? After you had passed through the world's densest cypress forest. It had been a most unusual forest, that Turkish cemetery at Scutari, just across the Bosporus from Istanbul, alleys and paths between innumerable cypresses and, under them, innumerable upright and fallen tombstones with weather-worn Arabic inscriptions. The cemetery had long ago ceased to be used. Its dead had been dead for a very long time. Out of their bodies bad sprung mighty tree trunks, 60, 80 feet high, growing into the changing seasons and into the stillness which in that grove was so great that no room was left for melancholy. Nowhere did one feel so strongly as here that the dead might be asleep. They were the dead of a world which had allowed its living to live peacefully, the dead of a humanity without hurry. After a short wandering through the cemetery, then through the narrow, hilly lanes of Scutari, I came upon a little mosque which revealed itself as such only in the beautiful ornamental arabesques over the door. As the door was half open I entered, and stood in a dusky room, in the center of which several figures sat on a carpet in a circle around an old man. They all wore long cloaks and high, brown, brimless felt hats. The old imam was reciting a passage from the Quran in a monotonous voice. Along one wall sat a few musicians, drum beaters, flutists, and kamangia players with their long-necked, violin-like instruments. It struck me that this strange assembly must be the whirling dervishes of whom I had heard so much. A mystic order that aimed at bringing about, by means of certain rhythmically repeat and intensified movements, an ecstatic trance in the adept which was said to enable him to achieve a direct and personal experience of God. The silence which followed the imam's recitation was suddenly broken by the thin, high-pitched sound of a flute, and the music set in monotonously, almost wailingly. As if with one movement. The dervishes rose, threw off their cloaks and stood in their white, flowing tunics which reached to the ankles and were belted at the waist with knotted scarves. Then each of them made a half-turn, so that, standing in a circle, they faced one another in pairs, whereupon they crossed their arms over the chest and bowed deeply before one another, and I had to think of the old minuet, and of cavaliers in embroidered coats bowing before their ladies. The next moment all the dervishes stretched their arms sidewise, the right palm turned upward and the left downward. Like a whispered chant, the word Huwa, he, that is, God, came from their lips. With this softly breathed sound on his lips, each man began to turn slowly on his axis, swaying in rhythm with the music that seemed to come from a great distance. They threw back their heads, closed their eyes, and a smooth rigidity spread over their faces. Faster and faster became the circling movement, the voluminous tunics rose and formed wide circles around the spinning figures, making them resemble white, swirling eddies in a sea. Deep was the absorption in their faces. The circling grew into a whirling rotation, an intoxication, and ecstasy rose visibly in all the men. In countless repetitions their half-open lips murmured the word, Huwa, Huwa, Huwa. Their bodies whirled and whirled, round and round, and the music seemed to draw them into its muffled, swirling, monotonous chords, monotonously ascending, and you felt as if you yourself were being irresistibly drawn into an ascending whirlpool, a steep, spiral, dizzying stairway, higher, higher. Always higher. Always the same steps. But always higher. In ever-rising spirals, toward some unfathomable, ungraspable end. Until the large, friendly band which Mama Vitelli placed on your forehead brought the whirling to a standstill, and broke the dizzy spell, and brought you back from Scuderi to the coolness of a stone-flagged room in Cairo. Signora Vitelli had been right, after all. Her ministrations helped me to overcome my malaria bout, if not sooner, at least. As soon as any professional doctor could have done. Within 2 days I was almost free of fever, and on the third day I could exchange my bed for a comfortable chair. Still, I was too exhausted to think of going about, and time hung heavily. Once or twice. My teacher-student from Al-Azhar visited me and brought me some books. My recent fever-born remembrance of the whirling dervishes of Scuderi somehow bothered me. It had unexpectedly acquired a puzzling significance that had not been apparent in the original experience. The esoteric rites of this religious order, one of the many I had encountered in various Muslim countries, did not seem to fit into the picture of Islam that was slowly forming in my mind. I requested my Azhari friend to bring me some Orientalist work on the subject, and, through them, my instinctive suspicion that esotericism of this kind had intruded into the Muslim orbit from non-Islamic sources was confirmed. The speculations of the Sufis, as the Muslim mystics were called, betrayed Gnostic, Indian and occasionally even Christian influences which had brought in ascetic concepts and practices entirely alien to the message of the Arabian prophet. In his message, reason was stressed as the only real way to faith. While the validity of mystical experience was not necessarily precluded in this approach, Islam was primarily an intellectual and not an emotional proposition. Although, naturally enough, it produced a strong emotional attachment in its followers. Muhammad's teaching did not accord to emotion as such any independent role in religious perceptions, for emotions, however profound, are far more liable to be swayed by subjective desires and fears than reason, with all its fallibility, ever could be. It was in such bits and pieces, Mansur, that Islam revealed itself to me, a glimpse here and a glimpse there, through a conversation, a book, or an observation, slowly, almost without my being aware of it. 2. When we make camp for the night, Zaid starts to bake our bread. He makes a dough of coarse wheat flour, water, and salt and shapes it into a flat, round loaf about an inch thick. Then he clears a hollow in the sand, fills it with dry twigs and sets fire to them, and when the flame, after a sudden burst, has died down, he places the loaf on the glowing embers, covers it with hot ashes and lights a new mound of twigs on top of it. After a while he uncovers the bread, turns it over, covers it as before and lights another fire over it. After another half hour the ready loaf is dug out from the embers and slapped with a stick to remove the remaining sand and ashes. We eat it with clarified butter and dates. There is no bread more delicious than this. Mansur's hunger, like Zaid's and mine, has been satisfied, but his curiosity has not. As we lie around the fire, he continues to ply me with questions about how I finally became a Muslim, and while I try to explain it to him, it strikes me, with something like astonishment, how difficult it is to put into words my long way to Islam. For, O Mansur, Islam came over me like a robber who enters a house by night, stealthily, without noise or much ado, only that, unlike a robber, it entered to remain for good. But it took me years to discover that I was to be a Muslim. Thinking back to those days of my second Middle East journey, when Islam began to occupy my mind in all earnest, it seems to me that even then I was conscious of pursuing a journey of discovery. Every day new impressions broke over me, every day new questions arose from within, and new answers came from without. They awakened an echo of something that had been hidden somewhere in the background of my mind, and as I progressed in my knowledge of Islam I felt, time and time again, that a truth I had always known, without being aware of it, was gradually being uncovered and, as it were, confirmed. In the early summer of 1924, I started out from Cairo on a long wandering which was to take the better part of 2 years. For almost 2 years I trekked through countries old in the wisdom of their traditions but eternally fresh in their effect on my mind. I traveled leisurely, with long halts. I revisited Transjordan and spent some days with Amir Abdullah, reveling in the warm virility of that Bedouin land which had not yet been forced to adapt its character to the stream of Western influences. As this time a French visa had been arranged for me by the Frankfurter Zeitung, I was able to see Syria again. Damascus came and went. The Levantine liveliness of Beirut embraced me for a short while, soon to be forgotten in the out-of-the-way sleepiness of Syrian Tripoli with its air of silent happiness. Small, old-fashioned sailing ships were rocking on their moorings in the open port, their lateen masts creaking softly. On low stools before a coffee house on the quay sat the burghers of Tripoli, relishing their cup of coffee and their nargils in the afternoon sun. Everywhere peace and contentment and apparently enough to eat, and even the beggars seemed to enjoy themselves in the warm sun. As if saying, "Oh, how good it is to be a beggar in Tripoli." I came to Aleppo. Its streets and buildings reminded me of Jerusalem, old stone houses that appeared to have grown out of the soil, dark, arched passageways, silent squares and courtyards, carved windows. The inner life of Aleppo, however, was entirely different from that of Jerusalem. The dominant mood of Jerusalem had been the strange side-by-side of conflicting national currents, like a painful, complicated cramp. Next to a world of contemplation and deep religious emotion there had brooded, like a cloud of poison, an almost mystical hatred over people and things. But Aleppo, although a mixture of Arabian and Levantine, with a hint of nearby Turkey, was harmonious and serene. The houses with their stony facades and wooden balconies were alive even in their stillness. The quiet industriousness of the artisans in the ancient bazaar. The courtyards of the many old caravanserais with their arcades and loggias full of bales of goods. Frugality together with gay covetousness, and both free from all envy, the absence of all hurry, a restfulness which embraced the stranger and made him wish that his own life were rooted in restfulness. All this flowed together in a strong, winning melody. From Aleppo I went by car to Deir az-Zor, a little town in northernmost Syria, whence I intended to proceed to Baghdad on the old caravan route parallel to the Euphrates, and it was on that journey that I first met Zaid. In distinction from the Damascus-Baghdad route, which had been frequented by cars for some years, the route along the Euphrates was then little known. In fact, only one car had traveled it before me some months back. My Armenian driver had himself never gone beyond Deir az-Zor, but he was confident that he could somehow find his way. Nevertheless, he felt the need of more tangible information, and so we went together to the bazaar in search of it. The bazaar street ran the whole length of Deir az-Zor, which was something of a cross between a Syrian provincial town and a Bedouin metropolis, with an accent on the latter. Two worlds met there in a strange familiarity. In one of the shops modern badly printed picture postcards were being sold, while next to, a few Bedouins were talking about the rainfalls in the desert and about the recent feuds between the Syrian tribe of Bishranaza and the Shamir of Iraq. One of them mentioned the audacious raid which the Najdi Bedouin chieftain, Faisal ad-Dawish, had made a short time ago into southern Iraq, and frequently the name of the Grand Man of Arabia, Ibn Saud, cropped up. Ancient muzzle loaders with long barrels and silver inlaid butts, guns which nobody was buying anymore because the modern repeating rifles were far more effective, led a dreamy, dusty existence between second-hand uniform tunics from 3 continents, Najdi camel saddles, Goodyear tires, storm lanterns from Leipzig and brown Bedouin cloaks from Al-Jaf. The Western goods, however, did not appear like intruders among the old, their utility had given them a natural place of their own. With their wide-awake sense of reality, the Bedouins seemed to take easily to all these new things which but yesterday had been beyond their ken, and to make them their own without betraying their old selves. This inner stability, I mused, ought to give them the strength to bear the onrush of the new era and, perhaps, not to succumb to it, for now it was coming close to these people who until recently had been so withdrawn and so hidden. But it was no hostile knocking on their door, they received all that newness with innocent curiosity and fingered it, so to speak, from all sides, contemplating its possible usefulness. How little I realized then what Western newness could do to the simple, unlettered Bedouins. As my Armenian driver was making inquiries from a group of Bedouins, I felt a tug at my sleeve. I turned around. Before me stood an austerely handsome Arab in his early 30s. "With thy permission, O Effendi," he said in a slow, husky voice, "I hear thou art going by car to Baghdad and art not sure of thy way. Let me go with thee, I might be of help." I liked the man at once and asked him who he was. "I am Zayd ibn Ghanem," he replied, "I serve with the Eagle in Iraq." It was only then that I observed the khaki color of his kaftan and the 7-pointed star, emblem of the Iraqi Desert Constabulary, on his black eagle. This kind of troops, called eagle among Arabs, had already existed in Turkish times, a corps of voluntary levies, recruited almost exclusively from Central Arabia, men to whom the desert steppe was home and the dromedary a friend. Their adventurous blood drove them from their austere homeland out into a world in which there was more money, more movement, more change between today and tomorrow. Zayd told me that he had come to Deir az-Zor with one of his officers on some business connected with the administration of the Syro-Iraqi frontier. While the officer had since returned to Iraq, Zayd had remained behind to attend to a private matter, and now he would prefer to go back with me than to take the more customary but circuitous route via Damascus. He frankly admitted that he had never yet traveled all the way along the Euphrates. And he knew as well as I did that because of its many loops and turns we would not always have the river to guide us, but, he added, desert is desert, the sun and the stars are the same, and, inshallah, we shall find our way. His grave self-confidence pleased me, and I gladly agreed to have him along. Next morning we left Deir az-Zor. The great Hamada Desert opened itself up to the wheels of our Model T Ford, an unending plain of gravel, sometimes smooth and level like asphalt and sometimes stretching in waves from horizon to horizon. At times the Euphrates appeared to our left, muddy, quiet, with low banks, a silent lake, you might think, until a fast drifting piece of wood or a boat caught your eye and betrayed the powerful current. It was a broad, a royal river, it made no sound, it was not playful, it did not rush, it did not splash. It went, glided, a widespread band, unfettered, choosing its sovereign way in countless turns down the imperceptible incline of the desert, an equal within an equal, a proud within a proud, for the desert was as widespread and mighty and quiet as the river. Our new companion, Zaid, sat next to the driver with his knees drawn up and one leg dangling over the car door. On his foot glowed a new boot of red Morocco leather which he had bought the day before in the bazaar of Deir az-Zor. Sometimes we met camel riders who appeared from nowhere in the midst of the desert, stood still for a moment and gazed after the car, and again set their animals in motion and disappeared. They were obviously herdsmen, the sun had burned their faces a deep bronze. Short halts in lonely, dilapidated caravanserais alternated with endless stretches of desert. The Euphrates had disappeared beyond the horizon. Sand hard blown by the wind, wide patches of gravel, here and there a few tufts of grass or a thorn bush. To our right a range of low bills, naked and fissured, crumbling under the hot sun, grew up suddenly and concealed the endlessness of the desert. What could there be, beyond that narrow range of hills, one asked oneself in wonderment. And although one knew that the same level or hilly desert lay beyond, the same sand and the same hard pebbles offered their virgin rigidity to the sun, a breath of unexplained mystery was in the air. What could there be? The atmosphere was without answer or echo, the vibrating quiet of the afternoon knew no sound but the drone of our engine and the swish of tires over gravel. Did the rim of the world drop there into a primeval abyss? Because I did not know, the unknown was there, and because I would perhaps never come to know, it was the unknowable unknown. In the afternoon our driver discovered that at the last caravanserai he had forgotten to take in water for his engine. The river was far away, there was no well for many miles around, all about us, up to the wavy horizon, brooded an empty, white-hot, chalky plain, a soft, hot wind played over it, coming from nowhere and going into nowhere, without beginning and without end, a muffled hum out of eternity itself. The driver, casual like all Levantines, a quality which I used to appreciate in them, but not just then, said, "Oh, well, even so we shall reach the next caravanserai." But it looked as if we might not reach it even so. The sun was blazing, the water bubbled in the radiator as in a tea kettle. Again, we met herdsmen. Water? No, none for 15 camel hours. And what do you drink? Asked the Armenian in exasperation. They laughed. We drink camel's milk. They must have wondered in their hearts at these ridiculous people in the fast-moving devil's cart, asking about water, while every Bedouin child could have told them that there was no water in these parts. Unpleasant prospect, to remain stuck here in the desert with engine failure, without water and food, and to wait until another car came our way, perhaps tomorrow, or the day after tomorrow, or perhaps next month. In time the driver lost his smiling insouciance. He stopped the car and lifted the radiator cap, a white Thick jet of steam hissed into the air. I had some water in my thermos and sacrificed it to the god of the engine. The Armenian added a little oil to it, and the brave Ford carried us for a while. "I think we might find water there to our right," said the optimist. "Those hills look so green, there seems to be fresh grass there, and where grass grows at this time of year, when there are no rains, there must be water. And if there is water there, why shouldn't we drive up and fetch it?" Logic has always something irresistible about it, and so it was even here, although the Armenian's logic seemed to walk on crutches. We left the path and rattled a few miles toward the hills. No water. The slopes were covered not with grass but with greenish stones. There was a hissing sound in the motor, the pistons beat hoarsely, smoke was escaping in grey wisps from the slits of the hood. A few minutes more, and something would crack, a break in the crankshaft or a similar nicety. But this time we had strayed far from the caravan route. If anything happened now, we would sit hopelessly in this desolation. Almost our entire supply of oil had flowed into the radiator. The Armenian had become hysterical. He was looking for water. Driving to the left, then to the right, making turns and twists like a performer in a circus arena. But the water refused to materialize, and the bottle of cognac which I yielded with a sigh did not do much good to the hot radiator, apart from enveloping us in a cloud of alcoholic vapor which made Zaid, who, of course, never drank, almost vomit. This last experiment drove him from the stony lethargy in which he had been lost for so long. With an angry movement he pulled Biskufia lower down over his eyes, leaned out over the hot rim of the car and started looking about the desert plain, looking with the precise, careful concentration so peculiar to people who live much in the open and are accustomed to rely on their senses. We waited anxiously, without much hope, for, as he had told us earlier, he had never before been in this part of the country. But he pointed with his hand toward north and said, "There." The word was like a command. The driver, glad to have somebody to relieve him of responsibility, obeyed at once. With a painful panting of the engine, we drove northward. But suddenly Zaid raised himself a little, put his hand on the driver's arm, and bade him stop. For a while he sat with his head bent forward, like a scenting retriever. Around his compressed lips there quivered a small, hardly perceptible tension. "No, drive there," he exclaimed and pointed to northeast. "Fast." And again, the driver obeyed without a word. After a couple of minutes, "Stop." And Zaid jumped lightly out of the car, gathered his long cloak in both hands and ran straight ahead, stopped, turned around several times as if searching or intently listening, and for long moments I forgot the engine and our plight, so captivated was I by the sight of a man straining all his nerves to orientate himself in nature. And all of a sudden, he started off with long leaps and disappeared in a hollow between two mounds. A moment later his head reappeared, and his hands waved. "Water!" We ran to him, and there it was. In a hollow protected from the sun by overhanging rocks glittered a little pool of water, remnant of the last winter rains, yellow-brown, muddy, but nevertheless water, water. Some incomprehensible desert instinct had betrayed its presence to the man from Najd. And while the Armenian and I scooped it into empty gasoline tins and carried it to the much-abused engine, Zaid strolled smilingly, a silent hero, up and down by the side of the car. At noon of the third day we reached the first Iraqi village, Anna on the Euphrates, and rode for hours between its palm orchards and mud walls. Many Igil were there, most of them, as Zaid told us, of his own tribe. In the shade of palm trees they strode among sleek horses on which sun and green filtered light were reflected, kings full of grace and condescension. To some of them Zaid nodded in passing, and his long, black tresses shook on both sides of his face. In spite of his hard life in desert and burning heat, he was so sensitive that during our fast progress over village roads he wound his head cloth around his mouth in order to avoid swallowing dust, the dust which did not bother even us pampered townspeople. When we again rode over pebbles and there was no longer any dust, he swept his kufiya back with a movement of almost girlish grace and began to sing. He suddenly opened his mouth and sang, with the suddenness of a mountain wall precipitously jutting out of a plain. It was a Najdi Qasida, a kind of ode, a swaying of long drawn-out tunes in an unchanging rhythm, flowing, like the desert wind, from nowhere into nowhere. In the next village he requested the driver to stop. Jumped out of the car. Thanked me for the lift, slung his rifle on his back, and disappeared between the palms, and in the car there remained a scent that had no name, the scent of a humanity entirely rounded in itself, the vibrating remembrance of a long-forgotten, never-forgotten innocence of the spirit. On that day at Anna I did not think I would ever see Zaid again, but it happened otherwise. The following day I arrived at Hit, a little town on the Euphrates, at the point where the old caravan road from Damascus to Baghdad emerges from the desert. Crowning the top of a hill with its walls and bastions, the town resembled an ancient, half-forgotten fortress. No life was visible in or around it. The outer houses seemed to have grown into the walls, there were no windows in them, only a few slits, like loopholes. A minaret rose from the interior of the town. I stopped for the night in a caravanserai near the riverbank. While supper was being prepared for the driver and myself, I went to wash my hands and face at the well in the courtyard. As I was crouching on the ground, someone took the long-spouted water can that I had put down, and gently poured water over my hands. I looked up, and saw before me a heavy-boned, dark-visaged man with a fur cap on his head. Unasked, he was assisting me in my washing. He was obviously not an Arab. When I asked him who he was, he answered in broken Arabic, "I am a Tatar, from Azerbaijan." He had warm, dog-like eyes and his one-time military tunic was almost in shreds. I started conversing with him, partly in Arabic and partly in the odds and bits of Persian which I had managed to pick up from an Iranian student in Cairo. It transpired that the Tatar's name was Ibrahim. Most of his life, he was now nearly 40, had been spent on Iranian roads. For years he had driven freight wagons from Tabriz to Tehran, from Meshk to Burjand, from Tehran to Isfahan and Shiraz, and at one time had called a team of horses his own. He had served as a trooper in the mounted Iranian gendarmerie, as a personal bodyguard to a Turkoman chieftain, and as a stable boy in the caravanserais of Isfahan, and now, having come to Iraq as a mule driver in a caravan of Iranian pilgrims bound for Karbala, he had lost his job after a quarrel with the leader of the caravan and was stranded in a foreign country. Later that night I lay down to sleep on a wooden bench in the palm-studded courtyard of the caravanserai. Sultry heat and clouds of mosquitoes, heavy and thick from sucking human blood. A few lanterns threw their sad, dim light into the darkness. Some horses, belonging perhaps to the landlord, were tethered to one of the walls. Ibrahim, the Tatar, was brushing one of them. From the way he handled it one could see that he not only knew horses but loved them. His fingers stroked the shaggy mane as a lover might stroke his mistress. An idea came suddenly to my mind. I was on my way to Iran, and long months of travel on horseback lay ahead of me. Why not take this man along? He seemed to be a good and quiet man, and I would surely need somebody like him, who knew almost every road in Iran and was at home in every caravanserai. When I suggested next morning that I might engage him as my servant, he almost wept with gratitude and said to me in Persian, "Hazrat, you will never regret it." It was noon of the 5th day of the car journey from Aleppo when I caught my first view of the widespread oasis of Baghdad. From between the crowns of myriads of palms shone a gilded mosque cupola and a tall minaret. On both sides of the road lay a vast, ancient graveyard with crumbling tombstones, grey and barren and forsaken. Fine, grey dust hovered motionless over it, and in the hard light of the noon this dusty greyness was like a silver-embroidered gauze veil, a misty partition between the dead world of the past and the living present. So, it should always be, I thought to myself, when one approaches a city whose past has been so entirely different from its present that the mind cannot encompass the difference. And then we dived into the midst of the palms, mile after mile of enormous tree trunks and curving fronds until suddenly the palm groves stopped short at the steep bank of the Tigris. This river was unlike the Euphrates, muddy green, heavy, and gurgling, like an exotic stranger after the silent, royal flow of that other river. And when we crossed it over a swaying boat bridge, the fiery heat of the Persian Gulf closed over us. Of its former magnificence and splendor nothing remained in Baghdad. The Mongol invasions of the Middle Ages had destroyed the city so thoroughly that nothing was left to remind one of the old capitals of Harun ar-Rashid. What remained was a dreary city of haphazardly built brick dwellings, a temporary arrangement, it would almost seem, in anticipation of a possible change. Indeed, such a change was already underway in the form of a new political reality. The city had begun to stir, new buildings were coming up, out of a sleepy Turkish provincial headquarters an Arabian metropolis was slowly emerging. The immense heat impressed its sign on every appearance and made all movement sluggish. The people walked slowly through the streets. They seemed to be of heavy blood, without gaiety and without grace. Their faces looked somber and unfriendly from under black and white checked headcloths. And whenever you saw a handsome Arab face with an expression of proud, self-sufficient dignity, there was almost invariably a red or red and white kufiya over it, which meant that the man was not from here but from the north, or from the Syrian desert, or from Central Arabia. But a great strength was apparent in these men, the strength of hatred of the foreign power that denied them their freedom. The people of Baghdad had always been obsessed by longing for freedom as by a demon. Perhaps it was this demon which so somberly overshadowed their faces. Perhaps these faces wore quite a different look when they met with their own kin in the narrow side lanes and walled courtyards of the town. For, if you looked more closely at them, they were not entirely without charm. They could occasionally laugh as other Arabs did. They would sometimes, like other Arabs, trail the trains of their cloaks with aristocratic nonchalance in the dust behind them, as if they were walking over the tessellated floors of marble palaces. They let their women stroll over the streets in colorful brocade wraps, precious, veiled women in black and red, blue silver and Bordeaux red, groups of brocade figures gilding slowly by on noiseless feet. A few weeks after my arrival in Baghdad, as I was strolling through the great bazaar, a shout reverberated from one of the dusky, barrel-roofed passageways. From around a corner a man raced by, then another, and a third, and the people in the bazaar started to run as if gripped by a terror of which they, but not I, knew the reason. Beat of horses' hooves, a rider with a terrified face galloped into the crowd, which broke before him. More running people, all coming from one direction and carrying the shoppers in the bazaar along with them. In jolts and jerks, the whole throng began to press forward. Shopkeepers placed with frantic hurry wooden planks before their shops. Nobody spoke. No one called out to another. Only off and on you could hear the cries of falling people. A child wailed piercingly. What has happened? No answer. Pale faces everywhere. A heavy wagon, still half loaded with bales, rushed driverless with galloping horses through the narrow lane. Somewhere in the distance a mound of earthenware vessels crashed down, and I could distinctly hear the sherds rolling on the ground. Apart from these isolated sounds and the tramping and panting of the people, there was a deep, tense silence, such as sometimes occurs at the beginning of an earthquake. Only the clattering steps of running feet, sometimes the scream of a woman or child broke out of the pressing, flowing mass. Again, some riders. Panic, flight, and silence. A mad confusion at the crossings of the covered streets. Caught in the throng at one of these crossings, I could not move forward or backward, and indeed did not know where to go. At that moment I felt someone grasp my arm, and there was Zaid, pulling me toward him and behind a barrier of barrels between two shops. "Don't budge," he whispered. Something whizzed by, a rifle bullet. Impossible. From far away, somewhere deep in the bazaar, came the muffled roar of many voices. Again, something whizzed and whined, and this time there was no possibility of mistaking it, it was a bullet. In the distance a faint, rattling sound, as if somebody were scattering dry peas over a hard floor. It slowly approached and grew in volume, that regular, repeated rattling, and then I recognized it, machine guns. Once again, as so many times before, Baghdad had risen in revolt. On the preceding day, the 29th of May 1924, the Iraqi parliament had ratified, much against the popular will, a treaty of friendship with Great Britain, and now a nation in despair was trying to defend itself against the friendship of a great European power. As I subsequently learned, all entrances to the bazaar had been sealed off by British troops to suppress a demonstration, and many people were killed that day by indiscriminate cross-firing into the bazaar. Had it not been for Zaid, I would probably have run straight into the machine gun fire. That was the real beginning of our friendship. Zaid's world-wise, reticent manliness appealed strongly to me, and he, on his part, had quite obviously taken a liking to the young European who had so little prejudice in him against the Arabs and their manner of living. He told me the simple story of his life. How he, as his father before him, had grown up in the service of the rulers of Hale, the Shamir dynasty of Ibn Rashid, and how, when Hale was conquered by Ibn Saud in 1921 and the last Amir of the house of Ibn Rashid became Ibn Saud's prisoner, many men of the Shamir tribe, and Zaid among them, left their homelands, preferring an uncertain future to submission to a new ruler. And there he was, wearing the seven-pointed star of Iraq on his eagle and pining for the land of his youth. During the weeks of my sojourn in Iraq we saw a lot of each other and remained in touch through the years that followed. I wrote to him occasionally, and once or twice a year sent him a small present purchased in one of the Iranian or Afghan bazaars. And every time he would answer in his clumsy, almost illegible scrawl, recalling the days we had spent together riding along the banks of the Euphrates or visiting the winged lions in the ruins of Babylon. Finally, when I came to Arabia in 1927, I asked him to join me, which he did in the following year. And ever since he has been my companion, more a comrade than a servant. In the early 20s automobiles were still comparatively rare in Iran, and only a few cars plied for hire between the main centers. If one wanted to leave the 3 or 4 trunk roads, one had to depend on horse-driven vehicles, and even these could not go everywhere, for there were many parts of Iran where no roads existed at all. For someone like me, avid to meet the people of the land on their own terms, travel on horseback was clearly indicated. And so, during my last week in Baghdad, assisted by Ibrahim, I attended every morning the horse market outside the city. After days of negotiations, I purchased a horse for myself and a mule for Ibrahim. My mount was a beautiful chestnut stallion of South Iranian breed, while the mule, a lively, obstinate animal with muscles like steel cables under a gray velvet skin, had obviously come from Turkey. It would easily carry, apart from its rider, the large saddlebags in which I was to keep all my personal necessities. Riding my horse and leading the mule by the halter, Ibrahim set out one morning toward Kanikan, the last Iraqi town on the Iranian frontier and terminus of a branch line of the Baghdad Railway, and I followed 2 days later by train, to meet him there. We left Kanikan and the Arabian world behind us. Before us stood yellow hills, like sentinels against the higher mountains, the mountains of the Iranian plateau, a new, waiting world. The frontier post was a lonely little building topped by a faded, tattooed flag in green, white, and red with the symbol of the lion with sword and rising sun. A few customs officers in sloppy uniforms and white slippers on their feet, black of hair and white of skin, examined my scanty luggage with something like friendly irony. Then one of them addressed me. "Everything is in order, Janabi Ali. Your graciousness is above our deserts. Would you grant us the favor of drinking a glass of tea with us?" And while I was still wondering at the bizarre, old-fashioned courtesy of these phrases, it occurred to me how different, in spite of its many Arabic words, the Persian language was from the Arabic. A melodious, cultivated sweetness lay in it, and the soft, open intonation of its vowels sounded strangely Western after the hot consonant language of the Arabs. We were not the only travelers. Several heavy canvas wagons, each drawn by 4 horses, were standing before the customs house, and a mule caravan was encamped nearby. The men were cooking their food over open campfires. They seemed to have given up all thought of going ahead, despite the early hour of the afternoon, and we, I do not remember why, decided to do the same. We spent the night in the open, sleeping on the ground on our blankets. In the early dawn all the wagons and caravans began to move toward the naked mountains, and we rode with them. As the road mounted steadily, we soon outpaced the slow-moving wagons and rode on alone, deeper and deeper into the mountain land of the Kurds, the land of the tall, blonde herdsmen. I saw the first of them when, at a turn of the road, he stepped out of a rustling hut made of branches and offered us, wordlessly, a wooden bowl brimming with buttermilk. He was a boy of perhaps 17 years, barefoot, ragged, unwashed, with the remnants of a felt cap on his tousled head. As I drank the thin, lightly salted and wonderfully cool milk, I saw over the rim of the bowl the blue eyes that were fixedly gazing at me. There was something in them of the brittle, damp sweet fogginess which lies over newborn animals, a primeval sleepiness, not yet quite broken. In the afternoon we reached a Kurdish tent village that lay softly tucked between hilly slopes. The tents resembled those of Bedouin half-nomads in Syria or Iraq, coarse black cloth of goat hair stretched over several poles, with walls of straw matting. A stream was flowing nearby, its banks shaded by groups of white poplars. On a rock over the water a family of storks excitedly clattered their beaks and beat their wings. A man in an indigo blue jacket was striding with long, light steps toward the tents. Out of his earthbound but nevertheless very loose movements spoke old nomad blood. A woman wearing an amaranth red, trailing dress, with a tall earthenware jar on her shoulder, slowly approached the stream. Her thighs were clearly outlined against the soft cloth of her dress, they were long and tensed like violin strings. She knelt down by the water's edge and bent over to scoop water into her jar. Her turban-like headdress came loose and touched, like a red stream of blood, the glittering surface of the water, but only for an instant, to be taken up and again wound around the head with a single, gliding gesture that still belonged, as it were, to her kneeling down and was part of the same movement. Somewhat later I sat on the bank, in the company of an old man and 4 young women. All 4 had the perfect charm and naturalness born of life in freedom, beauty that was aware of itself and yet was chaste, pride which knew no hiding and yet was hardly distinguishable from shyness and humility. The prettiest among them bore the chirping bird named Tutu, with the vowel pronounced as in French. Her entire forehead was covered, down to the delicate brow, by a carmine red scarf. The eyelids were tinted with antimony. From under the scarf protruded auburn locks with little silver chains braided into them. At every movement of the head, they tinkled against the tender, concave cheek line. We all enjoyed the conversation, although my Persian was still clumsy. The Kurds have a language of their own. But most of them also understand Persian, which is related to it. They were shrewd, these little women who had never gone beyond the environment of their tribe and, of course, could neither read nor write. They easily understood my stumbling expressions and often found the word for which I was groping and put it, with a matter-of-fact sureness, into my mouth. I asked them about their doings, and they answered me, enumerating the many little and yet so great things which fill the day of a nomad woman. Grinding grain between 2 flat stones, baking bread in glowing ashes, milking sheep, shaking curds in leather bags until they turn to butter, spinning with hand spindles yarn out of sheep's wool, knotting carpets and weaving kilims in patterns almost as old as their race, bearing children, and giving their men restfulness and love. Unchanging life, today, yesterday, and tomorrow. For these shepherds no time exists, except the sequence of days, nights, and seasons. The night has been made dark for sleep. The day is light for the necessities of life. Winter reveals itself in the growing cold and the scarcity of pastures in the mountains, and so, they wander with their flocks and tents down into the warm plains, into Mesopotamia and to the Tigris. Later, when the summer grows up with its sultriness and hot winds, back into the mountains. Either here or to another place within the traditional grounds of the tribe. Don't you ever desire to live in houses of stone? I asked the old man, who had hardly spoken a word and had smilingly listened to our talk. Don't you ever desire to have fields of your own? The old man shook his head slowly, no. If water stands motionless in pools, it becomes stale, muddy, and foul. Only when it moves and flows does it remain clear. In time, Kurdistan receded into the past. For nearly 18 months I wandered through the length and breadth of that strangest of all lands, Iran. I came to know a nation that combined in itself the wisdom of 30 centuries of culture and the volatile unpredictability of children, a nation that could look with a lazy irony at itself and all that happened around it, and a moment later could tremble in wild, volcanic passions. I enjoyed the cultured ease of the cities and the sharp, exhilarating steppe winds. I slept in the castles of provincial governors with a score of servants at my disposal, and in half-ruined caravanserais where at night you had to take care to kill the scorpions before you were stung by them. I partook of whole roasted sheep as guest of Bakhtiari and Kashgar tribesmen, and of turkeys stuffed with apricots in the dining rooms of rich merchants. I watched the abandonment and blood intoxication of the festival of Muharram, and listened to the tender verses of Hafiz sung to the accompaniment of a lute by the heirs of Iran's ancient glories. I strolled under the poplars of Isfahan and admired the stalactite portals, precious faience fada and gilded domes of its great mosques. Persian became almost as familiar to me as Arabic. I held converse with educated men in cities, soldiers and nomads, traders in the bazaars, cabinet ministers and religious leaders, wandering dervishes and wise opium smokers in wayside taverns. I stayed in towns and villages and trekked through deserts and perilous salt swamps, and lost myself entirely in the timeless air of that broken-down wonderland. I came to know the Iranian people and their life and their thoughts almost as if I had been born among them, but this land and this life, complex and fascinating like an old jewel that sparkles dimly through multiple facets, never came as close to my heart as the glass-clear world of the Arabs. For over 6 months I rode on through the wild mountains and steppes of Afghanistan, 6 months in a world where the arms which every man carried were not meant for ornament, and where every word and every step had to be watched lest a bullet should come singing through the air. Sometimes Ibrahim and I and our occasional companions had to defend our lives against bandits, of whom Afghanistan was full in those days, but if it happened to be Friday, bandits held out no threat, for they considered it shameful to rob and kill on the day set aside for the worship of the Lord. Once, near Kandahar, I narrowly missed being shot because I had inadvertently looked upon the uncovered face of a pretty village woman working in the field. While among the Mongol villagers in the high gorges of the Hindu Kush, descendants of the warrior hosts of Genghis Khan, it was not regarded as unseemly to let me sleep on the floor of the one-room hut side by side with the host's young wife and sisters. For weeks I was guest of Amanullah Khan, king of Afghanistan, in his capital, Kabul. For long nights I discussed with his learned men the teachings of the Quran, and on other nights I discussed with Pathan Khans in their black tents how best to circumvent areas engaged in intertribal warfare. And with every day of those 2 years in Iran and Afghanistan the certainty grew in me that I was approaching some final answer. For it so happened, Mansur, that the understanding of how Muslims lived brought me daily closer to a better understanding of Islam. Islam was always uppermost in my mind. "It is time for the Isha prayer," says Zaid, glancing at the night sky. We line up for the last prayer of the day, all three of us facing toward Mecca. Zaid and Mansur stand side by side and I in front of them, leading the congregational prayer, for the Prophet has described every assembly of 2 or more as a congregation. I raise my hands and begin, Allahu Akbar, God alone is great, and then recite, as Muslims always do, the opening Surah of the Quran. In the name of God, the most gracious, the dispenser of grace. All praise is due to God alone, sustainer of the universe. The most gracious, the dispenser of grace. Lord of the day of judgment. Thee alone do we worship. And Thee alone do we beseech for help. Lead us the right way. The way of those upon whom is Thy favor. Not of those who earn Thy wrath, nor of those who go astray. And I follow with the 112th Surah. In the name of God, the most gracious, the dispenser of grace. Say, God is one. The self-sufficient on whom everything depends. He begets not, nor is he begotten. And there is naught that could be likened unto him. There are few things, if any, which bring men so close to one another as praying together. This, I believe, is true of every religion, but particularly so of Islam, which rests on the belief that no intermediary is necessary, or indeed possible, between man and God. The absence of all priesthood, clergy, and even of an organized church makes every Muslim feel that he is truly sharing in, and not merely attending, a common act of worship when he prays in congregation. Since there are no sacraments in Islam, every adult and sane Muslim may perform any religious function whatsoever, whether it be leading a congregation in prayer, performing a marriage ceremony or conducting a burial service. None need be ordained for the service of God. The religious teachers and leaders of the Muslim community are simple men who enjoy a reputation, sometimes deserved and sometimes not, for erudition in theology and religious law. 3. I awake at dawn, but my eyelids are heavy with sleep. Over my face the wind glides with a soft, humming sound out of the fading night into the rising day. I get up to wash the sleep from my face. The cold water is like a touch from faraway landscapes, mountains covered with dark trees, and streams that move and flow and always remain clear. I sit on my haunches and lean my head back so that my face might long remain wet. The wind strokes its wetness, strokes it with the lender memory of all cool days, of long past wintry days, of mountains and rushing waters, of riding through snow and glistening whiteness. The whiteness of that day many years ago when I rode over snow-covered Iranian mountains without path, pushing slowly forward, every step of the horse a sinking down into snow and the next a toilsome clambering out of snow. At noon of that day, I remember, we rested in a village inhabited by strange folk who resembled gypsies. 10 or 12 holes in the ground, roofed over with low domes of brushwood and earth, gave the lonely settlement. It was in southeastern Iran, in the province of Kerman, the appearance of a city of moles. Like underworld beings from a fairy tale, people crawled out of the dark openings to wonder at the rare strangers. On top of one of the earthen domes sat a young woman combing her long, black, tousled hair. Her olive-brown face was turned with closed eyes toward the pale midway sun, and she sang with a low voice a song in some outlandish tongue. Metal arm rings jangled around her wrists, which were narrow and strong like the fetlocks of wild animals in a primeval forest. To warm my numbed limbs, I drank tea and arak, lots of it, with the gendarme who accompanied Ibrahim and me. As I remounted my horse, entirely drunk, and set out at a gallop, the whole world lay suddenly wide and transparent before my eyes as never before. I saw its inner pattern and felt the beat of its pulse in the white loneliness and beheld all that had been hidden from me but a moment ago. And I knew that all the answers are but waiting for us while we, poor fools, ask questions and wait for the secrets of God to open themselves up to us, when they, all the while, are waiting for us to open ourselves up to them. A tableland opened before us, and I spurred my horse and flew like a ghost through crystalline light, and the snow whirled up by the hooves of my horse flew around me like a mantle of sparks. And the hooves of my horse thundered over the ice of frozen streams. I think it must have been then that I experienced, not yet fully understanding it myself, the opening of grace, that grace of which Father Felix had spoken to me long, long ago, when I was starting out on the journey that was destined to change my whole life, the revelation of grace which tells you that you are the expected one. More than a year was to elapse between that mad ride over ice and snow and my conversion to Islam, but even then I rode, without knowing it, straight as an arrow toward Mecca. And now my face is dry, and that Iranian winter day of more than 7 years ago falls back into the past. It falls back, but not to disappear, for that past is part of this present. A cool breeze, breath of the morning that is to come, makes the thorn bushes shiver. The stars are beginning to pale. Zaid. Mansur. Get up, get up. Let us rekindle the fire and heat our coffee, and then we shall saddle the dromedaries and ride on, through another day. Through the desert that waits for us with open arms.